Hello everybody and welcome back. Today is Wednesday, November the 29th, and today Venus in Libra is perfectly conjunct the self node, or at least there's different ways of calculating the self node, but it's conjunct the self node and it is applying to a square to Pluto in Capricorn by an orb of 4 degrees today. And that's the focus of today's video. I was just out walking my 2 dogs in the morning, as I usually do, and I figured I would mention something that is unique to this day, that I set out to walk my dogs with this in mind to make a video once I came back. And one of the thing that I noticed today is that where I live, of course, it being almost December, it's getting colder out, and it is fairly frosty in the morning. And what caught my eye were these spider webs that I think normally I wouldn't have noticed, but due to the cold temperature and the frost, the spider webs were frozen and kind of crystallized. And I started noticing these everywhere. And even people already have their one of the things that was kind of interesting is that some people have their Christmas decorations up already, and to look at a tree, like, because sometimes if you think about Halloween decorations, oftentimes people may use the motif of the spider web for Halloween, but in walking past people who had, like, you know, a barren tree with a bunch of Christmas lights and ornaments on it, but then it was like the crystallized spider webs were like hanging off this as if they were almost like part of the decoration, but obviously something that's not intended, something that was just sort of naturally occurring. And I started thinking about this image, this sort of aesthetic quality, and how the spider web itself is something that, if it weren't for the temperature, if it weren't for the crystalline quality, you may not see it at all. You know, because spider webs often have that kind of quality that you would just walk right into them and get tangled up in them, right? Whereas in this, not only are they visible, but they actually are kind of have a sort of aesthetic quality that makes them look pretty and attractive or something like that. But there's also this kind of funny kind of like Nightmare Before Christmas quality to it, because it's not, when we think about what we associate with Christmas, that's, you know, we make this kind of distinction between Halloween stuff and Christmas stuff, right? So we don't make that association, right? But I thought that the fact that it was visually appealing and kind of eye-catching kind of went with this quality of Venus square to Pluto. And so I thought I would just mention that before I get into whatever other ideas I had for this video. Now, the thing about this is that we have Venus in Libra, and Libra is a Venus sign. You know, Libra is one of the more interesting signs of the zodiac, because as the history of astrology goes, apparently at one point in time, before the system of astrology was consolidated into what we know today with 12 signs, right, that Libra didn't exist. That before the Greeks, you had a form of astrology that was practiced by, you know, ancient Sumerians and Babylonians and etc. And apparently they used the constellation of Scorpio, and the part of the sky that would become Libra was previously just the claws of the scorpion, right? And that they had to create this sort of thing. What would be the right word to say? It's almost a bit like, you know, after the fact, right? You know, that they had to fashion the sign, and they gave it the symbol of the scales. And it's kind of funny, there's even I've probably mentioned this in my astrology videos before, that there was a time when the illustration of the scorpion was holding, like a little scorpion was holding the scales, right? It was kind of like, it's kind of cute, but also a little bit bizarre. Which kind of goes with this whole theme of like the way that the spider webs are kind of pretty, but they're also kind of have that Nightmare Before Christmas kind of bizarre quality to them. And the way, there's something about the quality of Libra, which stands for the balance, right? And I was reading I have a bunch of these books. One of these, I have Duquette's book on the Thoth tarot, right? And apparently, I was also kind of thinking that if you were to look at this dynamic between Venus in the South Node and Libra and Pluto in Capricorn from a tarot association, I would say that the most resonant of the major arcana to this dynamic would be Justice, obviously, to go with Libra, and the Devil to go with Pluto and Capricorn. And in the Thoth tarot, I like using the Thoth tarot, but I'm not 100% on board with it. One of the issues I have with it was some of Crowley's decisions to change the names of the major arcana. He changed Justice into Adjustment, right? And apparently in that book by Duquette, there was some, Crowley was making these comments to the artist saying that, the idea of justice or adjustment being this kind of cosmic balance is that he's saying that this isn't like the person at the grocery store weighing up your groceries and, seeing if you've got the right amount of money for it, and then that kind of like consumer exchange, a fair deal for a fair product and all this. He's kind of saying that's a kind of that human idea of the grocery store balance of the scales is different than this sort of cosmic principle of balance that that you think about, what an angel or something like that might be like, that is so, is unhuman and of this kind of belongs to a domain that we as humans may have an idea of what's fair and just, but there may be a cosmic principle of balance that may seem kind of foreign and alien to us. And, even from our perspective, it may not even seem all that fair, right? But I was thinking that, there is this kind of thing that happens often with merchant kind of relations where they'll give you the deal like the baker's dozen, right? Where they'll throw in a little bit extra and be like, or they'll give you the discount or something like that. And you come in. They had a sale on the other day, and you missed the sale, but they'll say, oh, because you're such a good customer, we'll make an exception for you, and we'll give you this kind of like special. You're kind of like tipping the scale a little bit, but you're kind of like with a kind of a wink and a nudge, and it's like that's the kind of there's some sort of principle with Venus and Libra in that the scale being the balance and the justice and all and what is cosmically fair, but in our human world we often have to kind of make these sort of micro adjustments to kind of tip the scale a certain bit. And what's kind of funny about this is that in terms of, I think, like, I don't want to get too political here, but in terms of capitalism, part of what capitalism means is of a surplus value, right? And that you could say that, you should shop with us rather than the other guy because we give you that little bit extra, that little bit surplus extra. But if that is the dominant system, then it doesn't really become a surplus extra anymore. It becomes something that everybody starts to expect. Oh, well, the other guy gives me a little bit more of a surplus extra. And then, I heard the new guy down the street is even giving a bigger deal and stuff. And so there's this kind of thing about like cutting costs or whatever, or giving somebody a little bit extra, that there's always a kind of like that, where the scales are a little bit off, where is it a little bit not fair. And there's this this is, I think, where Pluto comes in. Because if you think about what Pluto stands for, Hades, the underworld, and all this kind of stuff, there is a kind of like, I was thinking, there's often these kinds of, in these kinds of polite transactions or whatever, you may say, "Oh, thank you so much," and don't mention it. Just don't don't mention it at all. But this kind of thing of like all the stuff that goes that we don't mention, that is kind of like, could also be like the scraps on the cutting room floor or something like that, or the idea that there is some place where there's all this stuff. I think there's also, one of the things I was thinking about for this video is this idea of social nicety and tactfulness and politeness and keeping the peace and all this kind of stuff. And I have to admit that, a few years ago, when, there was this kind of thing going on where people were, I think one of the things I don't want to get into here is the whole thing about identity politics, because what I have noticed, if you consider the kinds of people that you would stereotypically associate as being adherents of identity politics, that one thing that, I don't know if this is the case for everybody, but what I have noticed is that even the people that I would associate as being on board with the goals of, identity, even they are sick of it, right? Even they are kind of worn out and tired of the whole conversation and the whole dynamic. And so there's this kind of thing about Pluto being kind of like the devil in the details, or that there's this kind of thing I was thinking about. Do you guys remember the HBO police drama, The Wire? That they had a theme song that is called Down in the Hole. The chorus being that you have to keep the devil down in the hole, right? And so there's this kind of thing about like being people. There's this kind of thing about Venus and Libra on the Self node, where, as I was saying, there is this kind of quality to this kind of like the little bit that's left out for the sake of tact or social nicety or something like that, that is, it's there, you can see it, but you have to treat it as though it's invisible, right? And like in the similar way that, like, I could be walking my dogs and see these spider webs that are very much more made visible by the cold weather and the crystallization and stuff like this, right? But if I were to like point out to like somebody, imagine if you were like, "Oh, look at those cool spider webs on your Christmas deck," and they'd be like, "Oh dear, we better take those off because they don't match the theme of Christmas. They're too Halloween-like. We have to take them away," right? So there's this kind of thing about it that you're like, "That's cool, but maybe I shouldn't mention it," right? But in the same sense, it could be like, imagine you were visiting an old friend or something like that you hadn't seen for a while, and then you were having a nice cup of tea, and as you were talking to your friend, you were looking around and just noticing that their whole area is just covered in cobwebs and stuff like that, right? That, it would may say, it'd be like, "Have you noticed that you're, you don't say that stuff because it's impolite," right? And I think that what I was thinking about, like, politically speaking and stuff like that, is that there was, at one point in time, a few years back, there was a certain thing where I think there was a certain idea of, like, the moral indignation, right? I think that's one thing that Pluto can stand for, is that one of the uglier side of Pluto is there's lots of hate and this kind of, like, the underworld is kind of stands for this place where we put things that we really, we don't want to talk about at all, that are too triggering, right? Or that they're too, there's such a sense of aversion and because if you think about like the Pluto, the underworld, and the archetype of death and decay and stuff like that, it can be productive maybe to meditate on, the fact that your body is going to deteriorate and decompose and all this kind of stuff. But it's like, from what we live in, the way our world works is that we like to keep the ugly, the decaying, the unpleasant. We like to compartmentalize it and then create more of a clean, sanitary, sterile kind of environment, so we don't have to like think about worms and maggots and spiders and all, and those are the kinds of things that we associate. It's like the idea of like you pick up a rock and there's all these creepy crawlies and things underneath, and you're like, oh, B, I better put that back down, right? That's kind of like, we all know damn well that stuff is there, but you don't have to bring it up, right? So I think that there's something going on with the Venus on the self node square to Pluto, that dynamic is in effect where social tact, social nicety, and for the basic, I mean, I also have to admit that there, with all this stuff with the war going on, like I haven't been paying attention so much to all the details in the news about what's going on with Israel and Palestine. I did hear about the ceasefire, and I did start watching the latest astrology podcast video, but I have to admit that I missed a month because there was in the midst of all this stuff going on, I didn't want to just focus on that so much, or something about it just felt off to me. I don't know. I kind of slowed down a little bit on my astrology coverage, but one of the things that's been coming up to me is that even if you try to focus on the positive, right? Or if you try to not focus on all these bad things happening in the world, at some basic level, if you're sensitive and intuitive and you're open, there's this idea of like making the unconscious conscious, or that there's this idea that all that stuff is still there, right? And like there's this whole, and this is what I have certain problems with the New Age movement, because this is the whole thing that I do. Chris Brennan, who does the astrology podcast, was saying that he hasn't been sleeping very well. He's had like insomnia, and that he's been watching too much of the news, trying to keep. And this is kind of like, I don't want to get into all my own past history of mental health stuff or whatever, but I don't want to I think I don't want to look at that stuff too much, right? But at the same time, there's this kind of thing, if you're like, okay, we're not going to, there's terrible atrocities and problems going on in the world, but we're just going to be thankful for the good stuff and try to be a good person in my own little world. But nonetheless, it's like you have to admit that is, at some level, it feels wrong to completely just turn a blind eye to it, right? But at the same time, there's something about if you were to do the other thing and keep track of everything going on, that to me it feels like there's like a danger there, right? There's a movie that I got into recently that I ended up buying on Blu-ray because I just had to watch it again and again, or like at least a couple of times. This Korean horror movie called The Wailing, right? And in The Wailing, there's a certain thing about like this, I won't get into the whole plot, but one of the qualities is like there's this investigating the suspect's place, right? And like, if you think about having these hidden rooms or whatever, very Pluto, right? Having the secret room or the secret stash or something, and having all these like photos of like the crime scene and all these like, or the idea of going around and documenting all the terrible things and having all the pictures of atrocities up. And I think that there's also kind of like this, like a detective is somebody that would have to pay attention to all this kind of stuff and maybe get desensitized by it, right? But there's this, I think there is a kind of a fine line between like, if you were working in that kind of environment, and versus like, and paying attention to it, is there something like, by letting that stuff in, does it corrupt you, or is it there's some danger that you can't even look at it, you can't even acknowledge it, you have to, or put the speak no evil, see no evil, hear no evil thing. But I feel like if you're all open, it's going to register. It's still going to register in one way or another that it's there, that it's going on, right? But it helps to have like, I think there is a certain quality of like the value of being polite and tactful versus, I'm just thinking that like a few years back, I mean, everybody's exhausted with this Donald Trump stuff, right? But there was this stuff that going on about like, back when Trump wanted to build the wall, and there's all this stuff about people being upset about like refugees being detained and stuff like that, or people crossing the border getting bad treatment, and that there was this kind of like, social justice has become some sort of slur that nobody wants to be a social justice warrior, right? But there was this thing going on where people were like, if you were upset about whatever issue in the world, people were like, can you be polite about it, right? Can you not be, an obnoxious person, causing a big scene? Can you just, we know there's people being killed and murdered. We know that there's all these atrocities. Can you just be polite? And there's something about that back in the days when it was like Trump was first getting into power. Like, I was more like, it seemed kind of odd, this whole thing, this demand for politeness, especially when, like if anything, this is like when things are the least polite, right? When you were electing somebody who's like the least polite person, and you're wanting the critics and the opposition or the other side of the spectrum to be polite, right? But I think there's this idea of like, in the sense that like there's like the good, the beautiful, and the true, right? And Venus what does Venus stand for? Venus stands for things like what is pleasurable, what is pleasing, what is harmonious, what is beautiful, right? But the thing is with Venus and Libra and the Self Node is that there is, in order to maintain a sense of peace and harmony and whatnot, like the scales, right? That you have to it's like we have to tip the scale a certain amount and take something and hide it in the cellar, in the dungeon or whatever, right? And you got to keep the devil down in the hole, so that we can create the sense of things being peaceful, friendly, harmonious, everything getting along. But you have to turn to sort of a blind eye to something, and it's not. That's the whole thing, is that the idea of it's maybe good and it may be beautiful, but it may not be entirely true because we're kind of omitting something, right? But at some level, we all know what we're omitting, right? But it's like, nevertheless, we have to get on day after day after day after day, and it's like, in order to do that, without everybody, like without, you have to keep the peace, you have to keep it going, and you want to do so in a way that is harmonious and beautiful. And if it's not true, if there's something about it that's not sincere, then it's at least aiming towards the ideal of a more harmonious society, right? That we want, we want to live in a world that's more peaceful and more harmonious and more agreeable than it really is in truth. And so there's a kind of like that there's a lie that happens, but it's a beautiful lie, or that it's a lie. It's the idea of a, sometimes with anarchist people, they talk about a prefigurative community, that that we don't like the way things are structured, so we're going to live our lives in a way to prefigure, this is how, this isn't the way it is, but this is maybe how it could be, right? Or the idea of speculation, right? To speculate about what a better world could be, like a kind of utopian idealism, right? But there's this whole thing that the utopias always become dystopias, or that even the name utopia means a non-existent place. It's a lie, right? That utopianism has to omit something. It has to omit the thing that doesn't, that the corruption, that the abuse of power, the injustice. You have to turn a blind eye to all this kind of stuff, so that the ministry of love can be called the ministry of love. You know what I mean? Like, and the thing is, not to be too, not to say that we want to have a totalitarian state where the truth is, everybody who tells the truth is thrown into some kind of a dungeon or something like that. But that there's something about like you have make white lies. You have to do certain things for the sake of harmony and getting along, and and living in a way that is agreeable, even if there are actual, even if the cobwebs are there, even if Santa Claus isn't supposed to have spiders crawling on him or whatever, right? Like, you don't point out you have to pretend that what you see isn't what you, and it is a bit like 1984, I have to admit, right? You have to pretend that what you see isn't what you see, and pretend that what is in front of you is something that is better than what it is for the sake of social tact and social niceties, right? But that I think that rather than seeing this as being just corruption, that there actually serves a kind of a purpose, because to the other side of that, which is is basically, rather than keeping the devil down in the hole, is taking the devil completely out of the hole. You know what I mean? So, and I think there's this kind of thing about the when I'm talking about the devil, is I'm talking about the devil that is associated with things like materialism, right? And what I'm talking about as, there's certain things like the, I don't know, I don't like getting into all this stuff about, the whole red pill guys or whatever, but often that's kind of what the way they do it is that there's there's this whole thing that there's this world of an ideal world where, people are just supposed to like you for who you are, and you're not supposed to you're just be yourself and embrace and sell, but really they don't care about that. They just want your money. Right? Or that they just want, it's money and power and materialism that rules the world or whatever, right? And this is kind of like the devil, right? Because there is, in some sense, it's not that it isn't true, right? But if you make that the deity that you pray to, it's it is literally selling your soul to the devil, basically, to be that that instead of having this kind of ideal of beauty and harmony and stuff like that we're going to get down to the actual material nitty gritty of what's going on and all the corruption and all this kind of, and we're going to drain the swamp, and we're going to, bring out all the skeletons in the closet, and we're going to interrogate them, and, that we kind of have, in order to just get by, this is one of the things that I don't necessarily agree with people like Slavoj Zizek, and that in the sense that he tends to be more of an atheist, and I tend to be more of a person who's into spirituality and meditation and all the stuff that he does. But one of the things that I think Slavoj Zizek gets right is that the idea that there is a, that everybody knows that there is the truth, the way things truly are, and then there is some kind of a pretend reality that we have to live in, and that if we were to this is a Lacanian thing, right? That if we were to get rid of the pretend make-believe reality and deal with the actual truth, it's like pointing out, oh, did you notice that you have cobwebs everywhere? Did you notice all the stains? Did you notice all the imperfections? That, if you start doing that, it's pretty soon the pitchforks and the torches and the whole pretense of social nicety goes out the window, and we're left with barbarism, basically, right? There's a good Sandman episode about this, right, where there's a guy who is in a diner, right, and he I've only seen the Netflix series of the Sandman. I haven't read the comics. But there's this whole scene where like the pretense, the social pretenses that people live by fall away, and we're exposed to the cold hard truth of things, right? And I think this is also, it's like the danger. This is one of the things that I was trying to get at with when I included R.D. Laing in this video that I did about Libra. R.D. Laing was a Libra. And R.D., there's a certain thing that, like, R.D. Laing was talking about basic power dynamics in families or in love relationships. And that I think there's this criticism that, with Foucault is also all about this, like the hidden, the discipline and punish, the truth is just a product of power and all this kind of stuff, right? Whether you agree with it or not, the thing is, like, it could be true, but it's true in a way that we have to kind of acknowledge it, but then kind of compartmentalize it and forget about it, right? And put in, like, that in such a way that, like, in order to keep on living our lives, you can't just stare at all the atrocities and horrible things going on. That you have to in some way basically live in an imaginary world where things are better than they actually are. Because if you don't want that devil ruling your life, basically, right? And that's the kind of the tipping the scales a little bit. But where does that little extra bit go? It goes to the underworld. It goes to the domain of the devil, of Hades. And we have to pretend that doesn't exist, right? For the sake of getting along. And then the other thing to consider is that Pluto is going to be ingressing into Aquarius very soon. Next year, January, I believe, is when Pluto makes its ingress into Aquarius. And so us people who have fixed sign placements, we just completed the eclipses in Taurus and Scorpio. So we have a break from eclipses, but now we have a good long chunk where everybody with fixed sign placements is just going to get hammered by Pluto for a considerable period of time. Me personally, I was part of the Pluto in Scorpio generation. And so everybody of this Pluto and Scorpion generation are going to go through a Pluto square Pluto transit, right? And everybody with other planets in the fixed signs are going to be getting it as well. And one of the things that, like I mentioned in other videos, there's this whole association between Pluto and Scorpio and the AIDS epidemic. And that was like one of the things for me growing up in this time. It was like, it was an interesting time to grow up, because there was this whole thing that, like, things like AIDS and gay sex and the risks around this, like, for certain generations, this was stuff you just didn't talk about, right? Like, there's certain things that this was just the dirty stuff that you don't, it's not good, You don't bring up this stuff at the dinner table, right? You don't, in the same way that you don't bring up religion at the dinner table, right? You don't want to bring up religious disagreements or whatever at the dinner table. You don't bring up politics at the dinner table, right? That you have to have all these it's not that we don't admit that this stuff isn't happening, but if you want to have a peaceful family dinner with not have people, trying to kill each other, we have to keep the devil down in the hole, as the old theme song to The Wire goes, right? It's not that the devil isn't there, but we have a hole staked out for him, that the devil can exist in the hole, so we don't have to look at him. We don't have to stare the devil in the face every time we sit down for a peaceful family dinner, right? I don't know. Is there anything else to put into this video? This is my take, anyways, on the Venus on the Self node squaring Pluto, All right, thanks for watching. Hopefully you like this video. I'll talk to you guys later. Stay tuned for more.